This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. My guest today is Carrie Gress. Carrie is a philosopher, an entrepreneur, a prolific writer, and the mother of 5 children that she homeschools. She's the online editor of the women's magazine Theology of Home. She's appeared on Fox, BBC, and EWTN, and has lived and worked professionally in Washington, D.C. and Rome, Italy, and her work has been translated into 9 languages. In addition to her writing and intellectual work, Carrie and her husband started an online store featuring lifestyle products for the home. Carrie's the author of a number of books, including The Marian Option, Anti-Mary Exposed, and the co-author of Theology of Home, Volume 1 and Volume 2. She has a PhD in philosophy from the Catholic University of America and wrote her doctoral dissertation on human rights in the thought of Jacques Martain and Alistair MacIntyre. So I hope to have her back to talk about those 2 philosophers. But in this episode, I speak with Carrie about her book, Theology of Home, and we discuss a little bit of her work in Anti-Mary, and we discuss some of the themes of hearth, the value of homemaking, family, motherhood, and some of her critiques of dominant feminism. So, thank you for listening, and I appreciate all those who've written reviews for taking the time to do that. It does really help to grow the podcast. So please, again, share with your friends and family. Please feel free to comment, and you can see links to this show notes and other show notes at themoralimagination.com. So that's www.themoralimagination.com. So thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoy my conversation today with Dr. Carrie Gress on the Theology of Home. So Carrie, thank you for joining the Moral Imagination Podcast. So why don't we start? Tell us a little bit about your book, Theology of Home. This is not the typical book that one would expect from a Catholic philosopher.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really unique book because most Catholic books don't have pictures in them. So that was really just a fun aspect of this book. I think people have been really enjoyed the visuals of this. And that was certainly intentional. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But the idea for Theology of Home came to me, was on the treadmill, and I was listening to a song about going home. And I was just really struck by how, first of all, we all have this longing for home, of heaven, to be there with God, but also to be there with our loved ones, and how that's really kind of the goal of the whole Christian effort. But then I started thinking too about just, how many stories have ended with the heroine or the hero going home. I start going all the way back to the Odyssey, where things are resolved at home. There's something complete and full circle about going home. And then I looked at even the broader culture, and we're currently spending $420 billion annually as Americans renovating our homes and decorating our homes. And, there's home shops and home TV channels and just such a focus upon it. And, I was looking at all these pieces together and really thinking, there's something to this, that people really have this hunger for home, but it's kind of unmet because of the fact that it feels like so much of the push for home is very consumeristic, and yet the drive for it, I think, is pointing to that deeper desire that we have to be home in heaven with God. So it's kind of a natural starting point to have a conversation with people. This is a kind of book that I could give to anyone, which I cannot say about most of my books. But this one's really easy to give to people because there's something about it that resonates with them. It's not so much how to decorate your home, but why to decorate your home and why the home needs to be important. And really that it's meant to be a foreshadowing and a taste of heaven. We certainly can see that our homes could be hell on earth and hellish, and yet even if people have had that experience, they can still sense what an ideal home would be like. So there were a lot of things going on in this book that we wanted to express in different ways. But by and large, again, it's just that getting away from the how-to of decorating a home, but to the why. And also just looking at homemaking. It's almost a dirty word to suggest to a woman that she should become a homemaker. And yet, if you look at those elements of home, all of them are really beautiful and compelling. And I think that's what we wanted to lay out in this book, was to just have people give a fresh look at what homemaking actually is, to kind of come to an appreciation for it and all of those pieces, rather than just home decor, on a superficial level.
You talk a lot about different elements and essentials of home, but why do you think homemaking is such a a contested word or a provocative word, or
right.
why do you think that? And also, what do you mean by homemaking?
I think that's a huge question. And some of that goes back to my book that I wrote that came out in March, called The Anti-Mary Exposed, where I really look at what's happened to women in particular in the last 50 years. And, it's pretty amazing when you start seeing what these grandmothers of the feminist movement, how the way that they described homemaking and child rearing. And, of course, I think that the big lie that has been sold to most women is that our children aren't obstacles to our happiness. And this is why we have to have abortion on demand and, all of these other kinds of ways to free us up to be out of the home. I think they've also done an incredible job of sort of painting, you either have the woman who is very sophisticated and, she's in line with all the principles of radical feminism, or she's just a doormat. It's kind of those Aristotelian ends, those extremes, rather than actually saying, real women look different than both of those extremes and somewhere much more in the middle. So yeah, I think that there's definitely, and the rhetoric is incredible, just to see how women who stay home are described as stupid or uneducated and, they couldn't do anything else. So yeah, I think that all of these obviously have been an effort by women to sort of make women equal with men, but it's been a very disordered one. And I think much of it also is the result of women not having God in their life, not having a sense of where their real purpose is. And so they've really gone off track. And sadly, so many of us have bought into it, and we haven't really done a good job of combating it. In fact, we haven't really done a job of it at all. If you look at, the arguments that Hollywood makes, even recently when the pro-life bills are passing in places like Georgia, they're using the exact same rhetoric from the 1960s because they can. It's always about the patriarchy and, not wanting to really be pro-woman. And these are the same things that they're the grandmothers and great-grandmothers of these celebrities have been saying for years. So we as Christians just haven't done a great job of saying, this is all a little bit ridiculous. And the findings are really the case that all of this feminism isn't, in fact, making women happier. But the numbers are showing quite the contrary, that women are actually a lot less happy between, everything from the metrics related to suicide and substance abuse, depression. All of those things are pointing to the fact that women are incredibly unhappy in our culture. And, the argument is, well, we just need more feminism. And, you would think that if that was really the answer, we would see at least some sort of gradual increase in happiness. And yet it's the exact opposite.
And part of that, you argue, is that we've lost a proper concept of the home.
Mm-hmm.
And you also argue, actually, you talk about the relationship of men and women, but you say in your chapter on balance that the mother's mission is trivialized. She begins to sense her own work at home is not the common life's work with her husband. And we'll talk about that relationship. But the idea of how the home, in a sense, you're arguing, is a proper remedy, a reappreciation of the value of home, of homemaking, and the value of motherhood and the woman in the home is one of the remedies. Is that what you're arguing for this kind of radical feminism that I sometimes, now you can push back on this, but I sometimes call it masculinism, because it seems to me that the model of what a woman needs to be is not really, use the Aristotelian idea, is not really a full flourishing of woman, but really the model of what a woman needs to be in modern feminism is she needs to be as much like a man as she possibly can, which, I mean, again, this is from a man's perspective, but my sense is that feminism undermines the dignity, or radical feminism, obviously feminism has many shades, but the feminism that you address in your book, Anti-Mary, which I've read, it's an unbelievably fantastic book. I mean, you actually gave me a copy of it before it came out, and I read it early, and I've told tons of people to read it. And I've had people text me say, "Oh my goodness, I'm finally reading that book," because it's excellent. I'm going to resist all of my temptation to talk about that book, because I want to talk about Theology of Home. But that in a sense, it undermines the natural essential nature of what a woman is and what a woman does and how a woman contributes to culture, and kind of creates this false paradigm where either you're a doormat, and this is how you write about this, you're either kind of a doormat or you have to live like a man. What do you think?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I the only distinction I would make is it's not even good men that they want to be like. It's the worst of men. If you look at the promiscuity and narcissism and all of those bad attributes that we don't like to see in men, but somehow we think that they're supposed to be great in a woman. So yeah, I think that there's a very odd relationship that has been set up by feminism, because it really is this driving towards the masculine, a disordered masculinism, as you described it. But at the same time, it's also telling men, you have to become more like women. You have to, it really is this effort to sort of erase all kinds of gender distinctions. And, Gloria Steinem has talked about this in her most recent book that she's written now that she's in her 80s. And, she says that's ultimately the goal, is just to get rid of gender altogether. So, yeah, I think it's fascinating to look at what they were proposing ideologically, and then to even see how this is played out in the LGTB movement. I think you could really call that the fourth wave of feminism, because it's the exact same ideology. But that ideology would not have had the capacity to strike so strongly if we had had people that were brought up in intact families where they had a mother and a father who were, healthy and ordered and loved each other. And I think that, we can look back and see how much the family and the home has just been decimated. And yet, if you look at millennials, or you look at anybody in the culture at this point, we've had all these generations with this fracturing of the family. And what they're really longing for is a kind of home. It is a desire to be known and to be seen, and to be seen as an individual, and to be loved and have that kind of warmth. Because I don't think that it's readily available anymore the way that it used to be when when mothers are at home, especially those first 3 years. I think that's one of the amazing pieces of research that is being done, especially by secular researchers who are not looking for this kind of data, and yet they're seeing just how crucial and critical those early years of childhood are in the formation of the human person. So, yeah, absolutely. I think these two books have really been kind of two sides of the same coin, where the Anti-Mary is sort of describing what went wrong with the culture and, how we restore that. And it's kind of on defense. And then I would say Theology of Home is really, how do we go on offense as Catholics? How do we start showing what we have, which, unwittingly, I think so many women in the culture are looking for what Catholic women have, but they don't know that that's what they're looking for. So if we can actually provide some visuals where we show beautiful families, large families. We show dads doing what dads do best, being good fathers instead of the oaf on the TV commercial, which we see over and over again. That was really a big motivation, I think, for this book, was how do we start going on offense, and instead of just always being on our heels, feeling like we have to defend what the church says. Because frankly, the visuals go incredibly far. And I think that's why, if you look at the magazine industry, everything else has gone digital, and yet that still exists. It's losing money, comparatively speaking, but there's still so many magazines at the newsstand, and it's because women were reading these kinds of periodicals. That's how the culture was really turned. It's not because they were reading Marx. Most women weren't going home to pore over the Communist Manifesto or something.
Yeah, Theodore Adorno and all of the sexual revolution of the Frankfurt School, that's not their probably normal reading. It's distilled in those magazines, really.
Right. It's completely laced with it. And so, and that, I think that's part of our problem has been in fighting this, is we keep fighting it with arguments and books and academia to a certain degree, but we're just blind to the fact that so much of the argument has already been made for us in the public square through magazines. And, we don't have one really. I think the closest thing that we have is Joanna Gaines's book, Magnolia Journal.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But other than that, there's really nothing in the public square that's putting this out there. And so that's why it's been great to put our book out there, and people have been really responding to it. Even, I've been getting text messages and messages from people saying, just to even open this up just brought tears to my eyes, because I was finally recognized, the work that I was doing as a mom, and it just was very validating. And And I think that's hard, being especially Catholic women. It's hard to feel like your work is validated. You're sort of picked on by all sides because you're not the radical feminist. You're a doormat, of course. When in fact, most of these women are brighter than the average woman in light of the fact that they've had to think themselves out of feminism and out of the culture. So there's, this fight that's going on constantly. And then, of course, there's a lot of pushback on, work. Are you working outside the home? There's all these pressures instead of just people saying, we love what you're doing. Thank you for the sacrifices that you're making for your children. And look at how beautiful this is and compelling this is. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what's resonating with people, too, is that sense that finally someone's recognizing just the hard work and the importance of homemaking.
The book is very beautiful and inspiring. I mean, I think so inspiring for women, but also inspiring for men. I really like the book. And there's a section there about the privileging home above work, where you don't just address women, but you address directly men, saying that it's a problem when men, in fact, privilege work where home becomes kind of a launching pad for their career. And you give an example of one man who he says he comes home and he says, okay, it's showtime, right? Now I'm actually doing the most important work that I have to do. And, as a husband and a father, I know that, sometimes you get home from a long day or a trip and you think, oh, I'm tired. But the most important part, I think, is to do these things. And I liked how you addressed it. Obviously, you're right now talking about from a woman's perspective and a mother, and it is generally the mother who's the homemaker, but that a home also has a deep role for the father as well. And I liked mm-hmm. how you pulled that out. One comment I'd like to make, so every year we try to do a Burns supper. Robbie Burns, the poet, and there's this Burns supper that goes with it. It's in the end of January. And so we have this, a lot of families over, and I think last year we had about 40 children, and all the children, all the adults will play a piece of music or dance or do a piece of poetry. And there's this little bit of a Scottish theme. And I've obviously seen this before. My mother created a very cozy home for us and was also a physician, but she privileged home over work for sure. And then my wife and my mother-in-law, and I'm surrounded by a lot of people who do things. But it really struck me about for children. So this is at the end of the Christmas season, and I was struck. And part of it is you have to do this toast to the lassies, right? It's part of the Burns thing. And Burns, by the way, is not a model, a man that you want to imitate. But that's another story. But anyway, in the Burns, so you have to do this toast to the lassies. But I kind of, it struck me as I was preparing. That was my job. That actually there's something that takes place in the home. There's all this mystery. And a couple of writers alerted me to this. One of them is Elizabeth Googe, that there's this underlying mystery that children just kind of absorb the decorations and the order and the beauty and the lights. And all of this creates this deep, mysterious understanding that life is more than you immediately see. And that is, in a sense, the kind of core, it seemed to me, one of the cores of homemaking, that you're creating the conditions for a person to fully understand that humanity is beyond utilitarianism. Humanity is beyond prosperity. You have a beautiful quote from Solzhenitsyn, who realized in prison that life was not made for prosperity, but was made for a much deeper meaning. And I think that that's something I liked in the book, that you brought out this that homemaking has psychological and metaphysical impact or consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's an incredible example. I love that, thinking about that, just what's happening to them in the memories of all those children who experience that. And, and then it's not just your immediate family too. And that's obviously one of the things I love about your family is you guys have been so great about including all kinds of stragglers, including myself, but, and integrating us in a really powerful and beautiful way to impress those memories of how there is something just beautiful when a family can stop and sing Christmas carols together. And, it contrasts that with, of course, I'm just having this visual of, the family on their screens and sitting, eating dinner with their phones in front of them. And life really does become very flatlined versus the beauty of the liturgical year. And, you've got the feasting and the fasting and the waiting, and then the joy that accompanies the different feasts. And, those are the things that I think really get lost in the shuffle as well. And, I know for myself, it can be incredibly hard to institute those things, especially when you are juggling so many different things. And yet when you do them, things like bonfires or all those kinds of familial events, some of which happen very spontaneously and others that need to be planned out, but they really do make an impression upon the child in very dramatic ways that, a parent can certainly hope for, but you just never know exactly what's happening there. And I think that those are very precious things that we've certainly gotten away from.
I think this is the value of the hearth, that concept of the hearth, that in a sense, all of us leave our homes, and you have a nice chapter on that. We leave our homes and we go out into the world, and we want to make our way. But in a sense, if families can create a positive sense of the hearth where there's always something pulling us back, I think we live in a democratic culture. I mean, so we have the problem of egoism and selfishness. I mean, this is right in the beginning of the Bible. We see this, right? And you see it, you mentioned the Odyssey. You see it all you see this is a challenge. But Alexis de Tocqueville, as you know, he says that individualism is a dominant aspect of modern democratic life, where it's not simply egoism, but it's a turning to oneself and one family, if you still have one, and this individualism has deep political implications because individualism leads to centralization. Because the state, I think this is a line from Tocqueville, it's one of my favorites. Maybe it's a paraphrase, but that the tyrant doesn't really care whether you love him or not, as long as you don't love one another. And so the state wants individualism, and because individualism allows centralization. I think the market, in the short run, I think the market in the long run actually loses from individualism. But I think in the short run, some parts of business in the market, and like Robert Nisbet makes this point, that it also has almost aligns with the state for individualism. I think I think it's actually a mistake to think it's simply fundamentally the market. I think it's in the longer run, the market it relies upon all this cultural capital that Burke and Tocqueville talk about. But I think in one sense, what your book is doing, and the name of this podcast is The Moral Imagination, and I give a lecture on the moral imagination, kind of Burke's idea. It's refilling what Burke calls the wardrobe of the moral imagination. It is, as you said, it's not a defensive move, it's an offensive move. And it's and I like it because it's not a siege mentality of like, oh my goodness, you'll go into your home. We're going to actually create beautiful things as an alternative to the culture of death.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And what you're saying before reminded me of an article I read about a year ago. I think it was either in Wired or Fast Company. And it was talking about how more people feel at home by themselves in their car than in their own dwelling where they sleep every night. And, I thought that was it was incredibly telling because, of course, it is that, you're in a shiny metal box, you're by yourself. So, yeah, I think that there is something underscored about that. But why is that more home-like for people? Because of, again, what's happened in the culture. So I think you hit on a lot of those really great points of why we're seeing that. So, yes, no, I think that and I think as Catholics too, and Christians generally, it's very easy to become kind of grow this second skin where you feel like you have to be on defense all the time, and you have to sort of be fighting back. And I think, sadly, we're seeing a tremendous amount of infighting among Catholics today, which, it's kind of one of those things where it makes you think, well, who's our real enemy? Where is the real enemy at? And maybe we need to be pointing outwards more towards how we fill up the culture rather than sort of this infighting that's happening. And how do we start placing things back out there? In fact, yesterday I was talking with somebody on Facebook, and she was upset because my candles
Which is the enemy, by the way.
Thank you. Well, sometimes it's a necessity for some of us. Believe me, I would love to be off of Facebook. But this one was saying, well, why aren't you making beeswax candles? And, for the pure reason that they're just incredibly expensive. And it's a very tiny market of people that are going to want to actually spend money on beeswax candles because they're cost prohibitive. But, I pointed out to her, too, that we have kind of decimated the market. Like, show me one person who is blogging, who is a top designer and that's also a Catholic, openly Catholic, that makes, wears their faith on their sleeve. And it's almost impossible to find people like that. We have got a lot of great companies that are doing rosaries and T-shirts and, the smaller things, but it's very hard to find companies that are doing things that reflect the faith that have a deeper financial imprint. And I think that's troubling to me because, of course, stuff is important. And we know this as Catholics. So, we keep hearing, oh, Catholics won't spend money on this and won't spend money on that. Meanwhile, we're importing, plastic Jesuses from China. And that's what we're supposed to be satisfied as, for gift giving. So I think that there's on all kinds of different levels, offense can be gone on, whether it's, we buy a magazine company and start a magazine. Or, and even look at EWTN, who started that? This nun with no TV experience starts EWTN because she realized that we needed to be on TV. Catholics needed to be on TV. So I think, the hard thing is a lot of these things are not profitable, but they are in the sense that we're reaching out to women and can reach out to women in very different ways. I had a long conversation with somebody about our candles, and he was saying, it's kind of brilliant because you're invoking smells and scents that conjure up images for people and create memories for people in a way that's very different from making an argument with someone. And like this book, I can give my candles to anybody because we're in a very post-rational world. And this is a hard realization for me because, of course, all I want to do all day long is make arguments. And yet, when you realize those aren't getting you anywhere, you have to start a pivot and say, okay, what will get me somewhere? How do I help all of these people who are so broken and really looking for happiness and fulfillment and peace and joy? And so that's why I've had to take a completely different tack from, academic philosophy to something like Theology of Home.
It's very interesting. So I wanted to talk to you about this question of philosophy because you mentioned it before that in a sense, in two ways. One, the magazines that are very popular, Cosmo and all those kind of ladies magazines, a lot of it are distilling, say, Frankfurt School influence. Of course, people like sexual politics, Kate Millett, and all the kind of radical feminism, but also a certain kind of Frankfurt School of Marxism, Adorno and Marcuse. And you're trying to, in a sense, distill some of your philosophical work, and it's hard to transform from an argument to a picture. And of course, I make documentary films, and so I struggle with this as well. But I want to give you a quote from Christopher Dawson, or at least a paraphrase, who writes about this. In an essay he wrote, it's called The Historic Reality of Christian Culture. He's talking about Christian education. And he says, and you've mentioned Catholicism, but I think this actually applies not just to Catholicism, I think it applies to, broadly, Christianity, to say Judaism, Orthodox Judaism especially, but also just to a classical way of seeing the world. That is a non-materialist, kind of Aristotelian influence, somewhat classical, traditional, broadly. You could, ancient civilizations, whether it's China or India or whatever. Obviously, there's a lot of differences, but it's different from this kind of hyper-individualized materialism that we live in. But Dawson says that, and this is a bit of a paraphrase, that Christianity has been deprived because all the channels have been closed off by unbelief or choked by ignorance. And so that the means by which we communicate these ideas, Christian ideas or ideas of the transcendent, are closed. Nobody wants to believe in philosophy because it has become an esoteric discipline. Theology is incomprehensible. I think there's a renewal, by the way, of some good philosophy and good theology, but a lot of it become incomprehensible. And then he said all these art and channels of communication are lost. So we have to reawaken what Burke calls the moral imagination. So maybe you could talk just a little bit about this realization or some of the arguments that you are trying to distill. I mean, you said, I made this defensive argument or diagnostic argument in the Anti-Mary Exposed, and now I'm making a pro-positive pathway in Theology of Home. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of background there because I do think that philosophy has, you're absolutely right to pull out that quote, that philosophy has cut itself off from the broader culture. In fact, I think, if I ever want to end a conversation with somebody or leave them speechless, I just tell them I have a PhD in philosophy, and they have nowhere to go with that. I mean, to a person almost, other than people that have studied some philosophy, to a deeper degree, most people have no idea what philosophy is at this stage. The idea that ideas and wonder and all of that has been completely lost. And I think there's this incredible amount of jargon that has entered into philosophy. So much so that actually when I was in graduate school, I said, probably even out loud, I will never work on women's issues. Largely because I just thought the books I was reading about women, even the beloved Edith Stein, they're so incomprehensible because the language is so full of specific nuance. You can read one sentence and spend 2 days on it just trying to figure out what Stein or others mean exactly by a specific word. And, most people just don't have time or patience or interest in that kind of deep philosophical effort. But I think the more that I looked at the culture, the more I really realized at the heart of the problem is women. And we see this, Satan knows this. He gets Eve, he gets everybody. Well, you get women, you get everybody. And, how is it that we've gone from Judeo-Christian culture to one now where, we're doing the unthinkable, we've justified and glorified the killing of our own children, that very most fundamental of relationships, mother to child, and yet it's completely been gone. How is it that ideas were so strong that we could convince women of this? And of course, we know there's so many people that live with the regret and the pain and the anguish from abortions. So I think for me that the real challenge was, how do we get people to sort of wake up, especially women? And then when you kind of look at the landscape and you realize nobody wants to fight this. And I have a tremendous amount of compassion for men because I think women have really bullied them into silence in a lot of ways. And I even talk about how even before the fall, you can see Adam doesn't want to fight with Eve. So I think it's just a fundamental reality that men don't want to fight with women. And yet we don't have enough women standing up and saying, this is totally intolerable. This is hurting our families, our communities, all these generations. And it's largely because we have kind of this mean girl culture. I had someone ask me, a gentleman on a radio show asked me, why don't women say more? Are they just secretly hoping they'll still benefit from feminism in some way? And of course, my response was, no, we just don't want to get beat up. If you look at what happens to women who are pro-life in the culture, it's incredible. It's awful. And they don't play nice at all.
Like what? What do you mean?
Well, I think, Sarah Palin is sort of your perfect example of how pro-life woman is treated. I think the Wall Street Journal had a piece a couple of weeks ago saying, where are the Phyllis Schlaflys of the day? Well, we're out there. Look at someone like Helen Alvarez or Janet Smith. These women should be household names throughout America. And yet they're not because they won't get booked on CNN or ABC or the regular mainstream shows. The producers kind of have a control over who's going to be allowed to come on that show. So I think that there's a combination of things happening, but the biggest one is that there's a lot of fear, but there's also a lot of just sucking the oxygen out of the room that we can't get a word in edgewise because we're not part of the narrative and they don't want to hear another side of the story. So yeah, I think there's some incredible challenges that we have that we've just allowed to sort of languish. And
you mean specifically like pro-life women?
Pro-life men and women. Yeah, I think we've just gotten used to the fact that we don't have a presence in mainstream media, that we don't have a presence in magazines, we don't have a presence in Hollywood, and you can see it when, people are very excited about Patricia Heaton just said something. Well, that's one celebrity out of thousands, and so many of them are silenced and won't say anything if they are pro-life because their careers will be ruined. So I think it's sad that these are, we've got these crumbs. And that's not to say that I don't think Patricia Heaton is great. I just think that she's one celebrity out of how many. And, that aspect, we've just gotten used to sort of expecting there to be nobody there. So when there's one person, it's something to celebrate. But we shouldn't accept this as normal, that, Hollywood has gone so far to the left and politics, especially involving women, have gone so far to the left. pop music, you name it, all of these different avenues have really acquiesced to this leftist agenda. So yeah, I think that's part of our problem is we haven't done a good job of fighting back with real concrete ideas and, books and movies and projects. I know we hear a lot about this actually from some of the great folks that are doing stuff in Hollywood too. Like we can't get our movies funded and, on and on. So yeah, I think it's an across the culture issue.
Tell me, so what do you, and this is a two-part question. One is, what do you think are the key elements of modern feminism, what you call toxic feminism, radical feminism? What do you think the key elements are? And then why do you think they're appealing or compelling? And this is especially in the light of your first comments where you say, well, most women aren't happy with this. We see this, they have a desire for home, and you wrote this lovely book to make the case for that. But yet at the same time, it seems compelling. People are taken in by it. Do you think, if I'm like making kind of a polemic argument or like a, contesting a little bit, like, so are you just in the minority or is the minority silent and you're actually voicing it? So that's kind of, I guess, where I want to go to. But let's start with, do you think are the key problems with, the key aspects of modern feminism today, and why do you think it's so compelling? And then I guess I'll re-ask the question of...
Well, actually, let me start from the second question, then back up. The answer to the question, am I in the minority? I don't think I'm in the minority, largely because of the example of Joanna Gaines. I mean, this is a Protestant woman. She does amazing home design work. She and her husband, Chip, have just had their 5th baby. They've talked about being open to their 6th. They have not been shut down by the LGBT community in any way yet. And she's actually polling more popular than Oprah Winfrey right now. So I think women are starved for authentic womanhood, authentic women who don't have a problem with their fertility and don't have a problem with raising children. I just don't think that there's enough examples out there because we've been told that's not what a real woman is supposed to be. So I think I think there's some fundamental lies at the heart of feminism that we are dealing with today. And of course, the first one I alluded to was just this idea that our children are an obstacle to our happiness. I think the second one would be that we have to become like men in order to show that we're equal to men, or that our husbands in the family are also kind of our enemy. And I think the third biggest one, of course, is just the fact that our careers will fulfill us. And those are the three, if I had to distill down what's going on, I think those are the three pieces at the heart of it. And all of those, of course, justify abortion and contraception and, all the reasons why we have to have the capacity to kill our own children, I think.
So you think you immediately connect radical feminism or just feminism? Like, obviously there's lots of different kinds, but let's just talk about let's say dominant feminism. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sure.
Is that fair? Okay. So you immediately connect dominant feminism, like right with abortion. And a lot of people would say, wait, what is children are like men, careers matter.
Mm-hmm.
You immediately go right to abortion.
Mm-hmm.
Won't you
and why I do that is because if you look at the beginnings of feminism, you've got someone like Kate Millett, who's very academic. Her book, Sexual Politics, is almost impossible to read. And then, I don't think should be read anyway, but, and then you have someone like
didn't her sister say like that book ruined lives, including her own?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, her sister Mallory has been very outspoken about it. And then you have someone like Helen Gurley Brown, who started Playboy. She started Cosmo, but she based it on the model of Playboy. She used the same agents for writers. She used the same kind of ads and articles and all kinds of things that she really wanted it to be the play girl. And so how is it that these two women can then sit comfortably in the same kind of category as feminists? And what bound them together was this idea of abortion. So you can see all these different fractures within feminism. And Phyllis Chesler has a new book that came out about a year ago, actually, on this topic of the splintering. She calls it politically incorrect feminism. And, just all the backstabbing and all kinds of drama that was going on in the early stages of the movement. But what really got everybody's wagons to circle was this idea of abortion. And you can see this today, the women's march that's happened in DC, welcome to everybody except for pro-life women. So it truly has bandied around this idea of abortion and this capacity to kill a child. And I think there are moral reasons for that. I think that there's also just that you've got all these women that had abortions and they're so broken. They don't know how to find healing. And so they have to keep justifying their behavior because of their brokenness, because they don't know where else to go with it. So you have all these different layers upon which women are still continuing to promote it. And yet that is the glue that has really held them together. And you can see this again, like I mentioned before, it's the same ideology in the LGBT community. As long as there's sort of this sexual amoral behavior, that's what's binding them together. And even to hear them talk about the importance of abortion, largely the sexual acts are sterile. So why are they worried about abortion? Well, again, I think it's all part and parcel of this same original piece that goes back to early feminism. But why is it so attractive? And I think that that's a great question. It's attractive because they've made it attractive. These women, you've got Betty Friedan, you've got someone like Gloria Steinem, who was stunning and who was the camera loved her. She was very chic and well-spoken. And, she was just an incredible spokeswoman for the movement. And so I think, and all of this happened around the time when television was becoming much more popular. So they used that medium in a way that was just brilliant. And the ideas exploded because suddenly people could see other women who were healthy and attractive. And then you have some place like Cosmo, again, that we know from Sue Ellen Browder that was just making up stories about the Cosmo girl to make it look attractive. So yeah, there's all kinds of manipulation I think was going on so that the real brokenness and the real destruction of what was happening within the family and, these hearts of women is not seen. But the savvy, well-dressed woman who travels a lot, that is seen.
Okay, so real quick, it's essentially you're saying that the last part is that a glamorous picture is portrayed, the actual costs are covered. Is that fair? Could you just explain really quickly? You just went over it quickly. What about the false stories in Cosmo?
Oh, Sue Ellen Browder she wrote for Cosmo for 20 years, and she says that they basically just made up stories about the Cosmo woman. They presented them as if they were nonfiction, and yet they were completely fabricated. And so she says, that these women could be anything she wanted them to be, but they could not be virgins and they couldn't be mothers. And that's really, I think, at the heart of what's been targeted is certainly virginity and motherhood. And that's why my book is called The Anti-Mary, because she's the virgin mother. Virginity and motherhood, of course, are the two avenues through which we have typically found our sanctity and our holiness. So again, if we can destroy those, then it's very easy to destroy women, very easy to destroy the family. So it's kind of a domino effect. But yeah, no, these kinds of stories are, have been falsified all over. And you can see them in Hollywood too, just
sure.
The way that promiscuity is glamorized and
with no effects, none whatsoever. Yeah,
there are no side effects.
Watching television, I mean, watching like a movie or something. It's always glorified. I want to ask you something, but maybe this is too provocative. It seems to me before I go to this question of or continue talking about why it's attractive to women, it seems to me, the way you describe it, I mean, this is like a man's ploy, right? If right, I mean, it's so like women in some ways are leaders, but it seems like this is what irresponsible men would want. I mean, I don't think this is what most men would want. I mean, I think a lot, or maybe not most. I think there's a lot of men who would say, "Well, I want a happy, stable marriage with a beautiful home and children." And obviously, there's the image of, then you must therefore be a patriarch. And maybe the answer is yes. But what does a patriarch mean? Of course, because this is actually an important philosophical and sociological question. But kind of a lot of men, and as you mentioned, a lot of men want a stable home, and they're not simply domineering. So, but it seems to me there's a whole group of men who would find this type of feminism like almost a gift. Like, this is perfect. I mean, it seems to me like feminism is a man's idea bought in by a couple of women. Maybe that's too provocative to say, but I mean, tell me why I'm wrong.
I don't think you're wrong at all. And I think Sue Ellen Browder brings that up in her book, Subverted, because her point was that early feminism was not pro-abortion, and that this was actually through NARAL and a lot of men involved in that did end up becoming such abortion did end up becoming such a key thing. And Hugh Hefner, of course, was for abortion long before it became legal and was promoting it. So yeah, I think this is part of the problem is bad men are so-called benefiting from it. And good men are like, I don't even know what to do. This is, how do I respond to this? And so, yeah, I think men are really put in a difficult position. So no, I don't think that you're being too provocative. I think you're right. I think this is one part of the reason why it has continued so much, because this is, all these benefits without any responsibility.
You mentioned in
the bad man.
Sorry. Yeah. You mentioned in Anti-Mary, actually, just kind of reminds me that that in fact the desire of feminism to destroy patriarchy, when we hear the word patriarchy, right now the mind goes to dominant man and oppressive of woman, wants to treat a woman like an object, a sexual object or a servant. But there's actually another understanding of patriarchy where the man has deep responsibility to care for the woman, to treat his wife like a subject, not an object, and then to protect his daughters and all the women and children around him. And so, yeah. I mean, if you think of like the responsibility of a man, I mean, you see this actually right in Genesis, right? He's to guard, to protect, and to serve and protect women and children. Mm-hmm. That this is and this is what the patriarch is supposed to be, not the person who pushes the woman to the side or uses the woman, but actually respects the woman. So it's an interesting question, because if you say we want to destroy patriarchy, many people would say, yeah, patriarchy is bad. But in fact, you could argue that what Robert Nisbet and other people like sociologists called LaPlay called the STEM family. I think Bonald as well calls it the STEM family, where you have, I mean, yes, there's trade-offs. There's some, you can't just do what you want. You're not radical individual. You're not just alone in your car, right? But you have these fathers who, in fact, are also protecting you, and that modern dominant feminism that you just described actually aligns with that Tocquevillian individualism, where you have now individual women who are easy for the picking, and so you see this Me Too movement, for example. Well, one of the reasons the Me Too can happen is because women are easy for the picking, and so they can be taken advantage of because they're not protected. So I'm glad I'm not being provocative, but it seems like a bad man's gig. I mean, if you were like a bad man, you're like, okay, let's come up with a really good idea, and we'll call it feminism. And in fact, I mean, there's actually a story about smoking with Edward Bernays. Do you know Edward Bernays? Mm-mm. Okay, he's a public relations firm guy. And I want you to go back to my point there, but it's kind of maybe an appropriate time for it. So Bernays was hired by the tobacco industry, there's a documentary on this, to sell cigarettes. And the problem is, it wasn't cool for women to smoke cigarettes. Mm-hmm. So they had to that's half your population. So he came up with this ploy to sell cigarettes. So he got some debutantes together, and he made some Freudian arguments, et cetera, but he got some debutantes together on, I think it was the Easter Day parade, like in the 1920s in New York. And he told them, listen, I want you to put cigarettes like kind of under your skirt a little bit in a provocative manner. And when I tell you to, I want you to pull the cigarette out and I want you to smoke the cigarette. Then he went to the news people. Okay, if I have this story right, he went to the news people and he says, hey, listen, there's a bunch of suffragettes, women. I think it was maybe it's that period. I mean, I might have the period wrong, so forgive my errors. But he said there's a bunch of these kind of women, and they're making this case. Maybe it wasn't suffragettes. Sorry, I think I got the time wrong. But there's these women. They're making this kind of like case for feminism and for women's equality, and they're going to smoke cigarettes, and they're going to call it torches of freedom, like the image of Lady Liberty, right. And so. They're like, oh, so they go watch. And when Bernays gives them the sign, they lift up the skirt, pull the cigarette out, and start smoking. And this becomes this whole story about like women's liberation. But it was just a tobacco company trying to get women to smoke because men didn't like it. And in a sense, there's a parallel. It's like if you're go back to my statement, if you're a bad man, you'd think, I got a great idea. Let's call it feminism of the dominant sort, that we make we make women very easy to exploit.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that there's a lot to it, and what's most amazing to me is how effective the word patriarchy is. I mean, even Serena Williams blamed her bad behavior on the tennis court on the patriarchy. That's all she had to say was one word. There was no explanation. There was just that's the reason why this happened. So yeah, I think it's become this buzzword that even if you were on the street and you asked people what it meant, they would have no idea even how to describe it or define it with any kind of nuance. And yet it's such an effective sort of shutdown point. But yeah, to your point, they have made kind of what the bad aspect of patriarchy is now the acceptable role that men are supposed to play. Whereas those levels of protection and all of that's really missing. And I think that was one of the most interesting pieces, was to see how many of these women actually had issues with both their mothers as well as their fathers. And so I think that there's the destruction was already there. And this is why you have this desire for these women to be individuals and sort of take things on as radical individuals rather than seeing any value in the family or in motherhood and so on and so on. Well, so yeah, it's a big problem.
I know we're running out of time here, so maybe just finish off with a couple things. It seems to me on the why it's attractive, you say children are an obstacle. We want to be like men and careers fulfill us. Well, it would seem to me that would be attractive to younger women, right? High school and college and right out of college, because the idea of children is still far off. Well, it's also just like simple. I mean, just like I'll have children later. And so that's not really a problem. And I want to play sports and do things and accomplish things. And so in that way, okay. And I want to have a career, and I'm very intelligent and capable, and I want to accomplish something. So in a sense, those three things there's nothing wrong with them, right? Because when you're 21 years old and not married, children are an obstacle for you, right? And when you do want to accomplish things. So, but why is it though that? But it seemed like it. What you've said from the beginning is that it becomes, in a sense, almost an ideology that, and the negative ramifications are hidden. Do you think that? What would maybe comment on that?
No, I think absolutely. It is an ideology, and people have bought into it, and you don't really hear the negative fruit of it until it's too late. How many women at 50, 60, 70 years old, even Barbara Walters regrets not having more children, and other women have been very outspoken about not having had children at all. And, you sort of have this great life until you realize, like, wow, there probably was something very important about having children and grandchildren and being surrounded by family and all of those kinds of elements. So I think it is, there's a lot of kudos that you get from working outside the home. And it's great to be making your own money and have that kind of independence and to be able to travel and, all of those kinds of things. So it looks very appealing until you get to that place where you realize not only can I not have that, but it's just too far gone. Like, I'm too old. I can't re-engage all of that. Those things that I should have done at 20, 30, 40, I can't do now. So, I think it's definitely become an ideology. And this is part of the reason, again, why you can see that the role of a homemaker is so maligned, because it doesn't give you these automatic kudos, and it doesn't give you immediate merit and status. And I think that's part and parcel of the ideology that we've bought into.
Well, I'd like to talk to you again sometime about maybe feminism, about anti-Mary, but we'll go. Well, okay, I have one more quick one. What do you say to somebody who says patriarchy made me do it? What's your answer?
I would just say, what do you mean by patriarchy? I mean, that's probably where I would start. But and then from there, it doesn't take too much to sort of get to the truth of the fact they have no idea what they're talking about. So yeah, I think it's just a kind of reactionary answer that doesn't mean much anymore, and isn't really that easy or isn't that difficult to push over once you start probing. But yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Okay. I couldn't let that one go, but here, so let me, I just because it was there and I thought, if I were listening, I'd say, well, what does she say to patriarchy? But I think there, as I said, there are many things I'd like to ask you. I'd like to actually talk about really what I call a new ontology of the person, and how we're kind of redefining what personhood means and how I think things plays out in a lot of these questions. I'd like to talk to you about your book, Anti-Mary. But when I think of your last answer about maybe the number of women who say, I wish I had had more children, like you, Barbara Walters, an example, or many women. It seems like this brings it back to what you're really doing with your book, Theology of Home, is that you're making, in a sense, a positive case now. Tell me if I've interpreted this correctly, but you've kind of gone over the dominant ideas of feminism are that children are in the way, we want to be like men, or men are an obstacle to us, and careers are what fulfill us. And what you're trying to say in Theology of Home is, no, actually, what fulfills us is a deep understanding of home and of loving relationships. And it's in those loving relationships that joy comes. And these things are not an obstacle to our flourishing, but in fact, the answer to it. And so it is, and tell me if I'm interpreting this correctly, it's like your response to dominant feminism is Theology of the Home.
Yeah. No, Michael, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think you nailed it.
So I understood it.
You got it.
Okay.
Well done.
All right. Well, my guest today, Carrie Gress. Carrie, thank you very much. We had some huge technical difficulties, so we got late going on, but thank you for joining the podcast. I'll put some links up, but we can find you at carriegress.com.
And theologyofhome.com.
And Theology of Home, and StellaMarisco.com.
Stella, yeah, well, it's all that can be found at theologyofhome.com. It's the best place to start.
Okay, and the Anti-Mary, Theology of Home, and many other books by Carrie Gress. Carrie, thank you very much for joining the show today.
Thank you, Michael. My pleasure.